The writ was valid, that was the problem. I'd seen forged paperwork plenty, smudged seals, wrong registry codes, dates that didn't line up with transit logs. You develop an eye for it after 3 years at Drev 4, stamping cargo manifests at the edge of the Venice corridor. But this one was clean. Imperial Licensing Authority watermark, countersigned by 2 notaries at Port Cresson, transit bond posted in full. The slaver, a heavy-set man named Koruth who smelled of processed feed, and wore a silver pin on his lapel that marked him as a Tier 2 freight broker, had laid it on my table like he was bored. Unregistered veil, female, livestock category, subclass perishable, awaiting your countersignature, adjutant. I looked at the writ, then I looked at her. She was small, barely waist-high on me, and I am not a tall man. Lavender skin, the color of early frost on stone, white hair loose around narrow shoulders. She wore a gray maintenance jumpsuit 3 sizes too big, belted with a length of cord. Her eyes were silver and enormous, and they were fixed on the middle distance, on nothing, in the way of a creature that has learned that watching the humans in the room too closely draws attention. I picked up my stylus. I set it back down. "There's a filing discrepancy," I said. Koruth's jaw moved. "There isn't." "The transit bond reference number." I turned the writ so he could see it, pointing at a line I had no actual problem with. "Doesn't match the format current as of Corridor Directive 11. You'll need to get it recertified." He knew I was stalling. I knew he knew. But bureaucratic procedure on Drev 4 was my floor, my walls, and my ceiling, and Koruth was a freight broker, not a lawyer. "Fine," he said. "How long?" "Office of Colonial Records closes at 1800. Tomorrow at earliest." He took his writ and left. The girl didn't move. I crouched down to her eye level. Her gaze slid sideways to meet mine, cautious, not panicked, the way a bird looks at you when it isn't sure yet whether you're a threat. "You speak standard?" I asked. A pause, then a small nod. "Are you hungry?" Another pause, longer, then the same small nod. I fed her from my own ration-packed dense grain bar, 2 segments of pressed fruit, and she ate without making a sound, watching me the whole time. I watched the door. I had bought one night, that was all. The terminal in the corner of my office was older than my posting, older maybe than me. I sat at it after she fell asleep on the bench in the waiting area, her knees drawn up, her cheek pressed against her own forearm. I pulled up the Colonial Administration database, the full archive, not the summary interface. The one that took 6 minutes to load and crashed if you breathed wrong. Section 14 of the Human Colonial Administration Act, the wardship provision, was written in 2271, during the early settlement period, when colonial outposts were staffed by lone administrators who sometimes found children abandoned at the perimeter. A licensed colonial officer could file a claim of wardship over any minor, human or non-human, found within a human-administered territory, if that officer had reasonable grounds to believe the minor was at risk of harm. The wardship froze all competing claims for a period of 60 days, pending review by the Colonial Magistrate's Office. Drev 4 was a human-administered moon. I was a licensed colonial officer, and a Tier 2 freight broker's transfer writ was, legally, a competing claim. I read it 4 times to make sure I wasn't inventing the thing I wanted to find. Then I drafted the filing, attached the child's physical description, logged her intake as an at-risk minor, and transmitted it to the Colonial Magistrate's Office at Port Cresson at 2:14. At 7:30, the ILA representative arrived. Her name was Delegate Sura Ennis, and she had the look of someone who had been rooted out of a comfortable billet at dawn and was very unhappy about it. She set her own documents on my table, a formal enforcement notice, countersigned by the ILA regional director, and told me that I had interfered with a licensed commercial transfer, and that if I did not release the cargo by noon, I would be facing a conduct review and likely stripped of my posting. I handed her the wardship filing receipt. She read it again. This provision, she said carefully, was intended for human children. The text says minor, delegate. It doesn't say human. The Vale are a recognized sentient species under Corridor Treaty 7. She qualifies. You're a garrison adjutant. You stamp manifests. I'm also a licensed colonial officer, grade 4. The act doesn't specify rank. Annie's put the paper down. Her expression had shifted into something colder and more careful. The ILA will challenge this filing. You understand that? That's their right. The 60-day review window stands while they do. I folded my hands on the desk. If there's a problem with the legal instrument, delegate, the magistrate's office will sort it out. Anything else I can help you with today? She left without answering. Koruth came back at noon with a local security officer in tow. The security officer, a young man named Devrit who I had shared mess with for 2 years, looked at me with an expression that was half apology, half bewilderment. "Solon," he said, "you know I have to ask you to stand aside." "The wardship is filed, Devrit. You release her, you're in violation of colonial code, not me." He looked at Koruth. He looked at the filing receipt I held out to him. He was young enough to still be afraid of the paperwork more than the man in front of him. "I'll have to escalate," he said. "You do that," I said. "Take your time." They escalated. By evening I had 3 different official notices on my desk, each from a different arm of the licensing authority, each demanding I rescind the wardship on different grounds. I read all of them, filed responses to all of them. The law was old and narrow, and exactly the right shape for the space I needed it to fit. The girl sat in the waiting area. I brought her a blanket from the supply locker, a heavy canvas one that swallowed her, and she pulled it around her shoulders without comment. At some point she moved from the bench to the floor, her back against the wall beside my desk, and I noticed that she had positioned herself so she could see the door. She still wasn't watching me too closely, but she wasn't watching the middle distance anymore either. On the 3rd day, the discharge notice came. I had expected it. The ILA had friends in the garrison command structure, and a garrison adjutant who tied up a licensed freight transfer with a 2271 wardship provision was more trouble than the posting was worth. They were polite about it, thanked me for my service, noted that my conduct review was pending, and that my grade 4 license would remain in suspension during proceedings. I signed the receipt for the discharge papers and set them on the desk. The wardship review was already filed. The 60-day window didn't care whether I still had a posting. It was a legal instrument, not a job title, and it would run its course without me. I went to the waiting area. She was on the bench, both feet tucked up under her, the canvas blanket still around her shoulders. She had a small piece of wire she'd found somewhere and was bending it into shapes with her fingers. Not absently, deliberately, the way a child concentrates on a task they've chosen for themselves. I sat down next to her. She looked at the papers in my hand. "Are you leaving?" she asked. Her standard was quiet and precise, each word placed carefully, like she was using a language she'd had to learn alone. "Not without you," I said. She looked at the wire in her hands. She bent it into one final shape, something curved, some form only she knew the name of, and then she set it on the bench between us and said nothing more. Outside the processing tent, the sun on Drev 4 was the color of pale copper, the kind of light that made everything look older and quieter than it was. We sat there, me with my discharge papers, her with her blanket and her piece of bent wire, and waited for the shuttle that would take us to Port Cresson, and whatever the magistrate's office decided to do with a 60-day wardship and one very inconvenient piece of colonial law. I didn't know what came next. I knew the law well enough to know the writ wouldn't hold once it went to review. That was enough. Her fingers found 2 of mine and held on, not the grip of a child frightened. the grip of one who has decided on the basis of evidence that a thing is worth holding. I let her hold on,